I don't think I'll ever forget the way she looked at me when she said it. There wasn't a tremor in her voice. No guilt, no hesitation, just a cold certainty, as if she were asking me to pick up groceries on my way home. "Just one free pass to sleep with my ex," she said. "Then I'll be ready to settle down." Her lips curled upward ever so slightly, a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. I studied her expression, waiting for the crack, the twitch, the little tell that meant she was joking. But it never came. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on my chest. I heard the clock ticking on the wall, louder than it had ever been before. Each second stretched into an eternity, a mocking reminder that time was still moving, even as my world stopped. I didn't yell. Didn't argue. Didn't even ask why. Because I already knew. You don't make a request like that out of nowhere. It festers. It builds over time. A thought rehearsed in silence, polished until it sounds almost reasonable. She'd been carrying it for months, maybe years, turning it over in her mind until it became her truth. And now, she was placing it in my lap like an ultimatum disguised as a confession. I forced my lips into a smile. A calm one. Almost gentle. The kind of smile you give when you don't want anyone to know what's going on inside your head. "All right," I said. The word slipped out smooth as glass, no hint of the storm raging beneath my skin. Her eyes flickered just for a moment. Surprise. Maybe even fear. She hadn't expected me to agree. She had expected tears, screaming, begging. She thought she'd see the man she could control unravel in front of her. But not tonight. I stood, walked to the closet, and pulled out her suitcase. The zipper rasped open like a blade being unsheathed. The sound echoed in the silence between us, a silence so heavy it threatened to crush her. I began folding her clothes. Slowly. Carefully. Each movement deliberate. A shirt laid flat. A sweater tucked in. Her perfume bottle slid into the side pocket. She watched me, wide-eyed, her mouth parting slightly as if to say something, but she didn't. She couldn't. I didn't look at her. My focus stayed on the task, but inside, my thoughts raced like wildfire. This wasn't about her ex. It was about power. Control. She wanted to see how far she could push me, how much she could bend me before I snapped. And tonight, she had her answer. When the suitcase was packed, I carried it to the door. She followed me in silence, her footsteps hesitant, unsteady. I led her to the car. The night was quiet, eerily so. The street stretched out before us, empty, as if the world itself had decided to vanish, leaving only the two of us in this fragile moment. She kept glancing at me as I drove, searching for something: anger, sorrow, resentment. But all she saw was calm. And that scared her more than rage ever could. When we reached his apartment, I pulled to the curb. The building loomed above us, a shadow against the night sky. I opened the trunk, carried her suitcase to the steps, and set it down. She stood frozen, clutching her purse, her knuckles white. I didn't speak. Didn't ask her to reconsider. Didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing what I was thinking. Instead, I simply turned, got back into the car, and drove away. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. But my face remained composed, the same faint smile lingering at the corners of my mouth. Because the truth was simple. She thought this was her test for me. But in reality, it was my test for her. And she never saw what I had planned waiting back home. The drive back was silent. No music. No radio. Just the low hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of tires against asphalt. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it suffocates. I kept my eyes on the road, but in my mind, the scenes replayed like a broken film reel. Her face when she made the request. The way her eyes darted, calculating, measuring my reaction. She thought she was clever, but I'd seen something else. Doubt. And doubt was a crack. A crack I could widen with time, with patience. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the calm smile had become second nature, a mask fused to my skin. I stepped out of the car, locked the door, and stood there for a moment in the darkness. The house loomed ahead of me, quiet and unassuming, but I knew it wasn't the same anymore. Not tonight. Tonight, it became something else. I walked inside, flicked on the light, and let the emptiness greet me. The silence here was different. It wasn't suffocating like the car ride. It was expectant. Alive. Like the walls themselves were leaning closer, listening. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, closing my eyes. For the first time since she'd spoken those words, I allowed myself to feel. Not ragino, rage was too easy. Too predictable. What I felt was sharper. Cleaner. Like the edge of a knife pressed against skin without breaking it. I moved through the house slowly, almost reverently. My hand trailed along the back of the couch, the edge of the table, the frame of the photographs hanging neatly on the wall. Smiling faces. Captured moments. Lies frozen in time. My gaze lingered on one in particular, her standing in the garden, sunlight in her hair, eyes shining like she belonged to me and me alone. I felt my lip twitch, but the smile never cracked. That picture wasn't truth anymore. It was propaganda. Evidence of a story that no longer existed. I lifted the frame from the wall and set it face down on the table. Then another. And another. Until every smiling reminder was turned away, as if even the memories couldn't bear to look at me. The house felt cleaner already. I walked into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, and pulled down a glass. The clink of ice echoed in the silence, followed by the slow pour of amber liquid. I took a sip, let the burn travel down my throat, and exhaled. This wasn't the drink of a broken man. This was the ritual of someone planning, calculating. Every swallow steadied my hands, sharpened my mind. I sat at the table, glass in hand, staring at the empty chair across from me. That chair had been hers countless times. Laughter had spilled from it, tears too. Confessions whispered in the middle of the night, secrets shared in the dark. And now? Now it was nothing more than an empty seat. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. My reflection stared back at me from the polished wood surface, distorted, fractured. Perfect. That's when the first pieces of the plan began to take shape. Not in words. Not in concrete steps. But in feelings. In the raw, primal instinct to dismantle everything she thought she controlled. She believed I was passive. Predictable. The man who smiled too much, who forgave too easily. The man who never raised his voice, who never fought back. And maybe I had been. Until tonight. Because tonight, her words lit a fire I'd been smothering for years. I finished the glass in one swallow and set it down carefully, deliberately. No slam, no show of frustration. Control. Always control. My eyes drifted toward the clock. She was probably with him already. Probably letting him touch her the way she once begged me to. The thought should have hurt. Should have torn me apart from the inside. But instead, it made me smile. Because every moment she spent with him only tightened the noose she didn't know I was weaving. Every laugh, every kiss, every betrayal, they weren't victories for her. They were steps deeper into the trap. And when she finally stumbled back through that front door, suitcase in hand, pretending nothing had changed, she would discover that everything had. The house wasn't hers anymore. The marriage wasn't hers anymore. Not even her secrets were hers anymore. I rose from the chair and began to walk through the house again, slower this time. Measuring. Calculating. Every corner, every drawer, every hidden place where her world existed. And with every step, the smile widened. Tonight wasn't the night she broke me. It was the night I became something else entirely. I didn't go to bed. The sheets were still warm from when she had left, and the thought of lying in them alone made my skin crawl. Instead, I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, staring at nothing, drinking slowly. Memories clawed their way out of the dark, uninvited. I remembered the first time I saw her. Not the surface details, the clothes, the place, the weather, but the feeling. The kind of pull that makes you think fate has just tapped you on the shoulder. She had laughed at something I said, a quick, effortless laugh that made me feel like the most interesting man in the world. For months after that, I lived for that laugh. For the spark in her eyes when she looked at me. For the warmth of her hand in mine, soft but certain. She had a way of making me believe in permanence, as if what we had was carved into stone, untouchable. I clung to that belief even when the cracks began to show. At first, they were small. A dismissive glance. A lie so subtle I almost convinced myself I misheard it. The way she said his name once, offhandedly, like she wasn't aware of the softness in her tone. I noticed, of course. I always noticed. But I let it slide. Because love is supposed to forgive, isn't it? That's what I told myself. That's what she wanted me to believe. Over time, the cracks grew. Arguments that ended too quickly. Nights she spent working late. Smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. I buried each one, told myself I was imagining it. Gaslit myself before she even had to. But tonight there was no denying. She hadn't just cracked the foundation. She'd set fire to the entire house. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes, and let the memories burn away. The man who fell in love with her laughter was gone. The man who forgave, who excused, who tolerated that man had died the moment she opened her mouth and asked for a free pass. What remained was something colder. Sharper. A man who could look at love, betrayal, and loyalty not as emotions, but as weapons. The ice in my glass had melted into water, and I let it drip between my fingers, drop by drop. Each one sounded louder than it should, echoing through the house like a ticking clock. Time. That was the key. Time would be the blade I used to cut her apart. Not rage. Not violence. Not hoes would give her power. They'd let her play the victim, twist the story, paint me as the monster. But patience? Silence? Calculation? Those would suffocate her. I rose again, restless, pacing through the house. My eyes landed on the drawer in the hallway, the one she thought I never opened. But I had. I knew what was inside. Old letters. A photograph or two. Little mementos of a past she swore was long buried. I had never confronted her about them. I never had to. Because keeping them hidden wasn't her victory, it was her leash. The more she tried to conceal, the tighter the rope became around her neck. Tonight, I pulled the drawer open. Ran my fingers across the stack of papers, the edges yellowed with time. I didn't read them. Not yet. Just touching them was enough. A reminder that I held the strings, even when she thought she was free. I closed the drawer carefully, deliberately, and turned away. The house felt alive again. The walls whispered. The floorboards creaked with anticipation. And in that stillness, I understood something with terrifying clarity. She wasn't just testing me tonight. She was underestimating me. That was her first mistake. I poured another drink, slower this time, savoring the ritual. My reflection in the liquid shimmered, fractured by the ice, almost unrecognizable. Good. By the time she came back, I wanted her to look at me and see someone she didn't recognize. Someone she couldn't predict. Someone she could no longer control. I sat down once more, letting the night stretch on. Every tick of the clock was a reminder, she was out there, making her choice. And I was here, sharpening mine. She thought she was escaping into freedom, into indulgence. But all she was really doing was stepping deeper into the labyrinth I was building. And when she returned, suitcase in hand, thinking nothing had changed, she would learn that the walls had shifted around her. The house wasn't hers anymore. The silence wasn't hers anymore. Even her choices weren't hers anymore. They belonged to me. The night stretched on, but I never felt tired. Sleep would have been a waste anyway. Sleep belonged to the man I used to be, one who needed rest, comfort, and peace. That man was gone. I wandered through the rooms like a stranger in my own house. Every corner I passed seemed sharper, every shadow deeper, as if the walls themselves knew something had shifted. This place had always been our sanctuary, a shared space built brick by brick on the illusion of love. Not anymore. Tonight, it became a stage. And she, whether she realized it or not, had stepped into the role of my unwitting actor. I paused in the bedroom doorway. The sheets still carried her shape, her scent. I didn't go inside. Instead, I stood there, staring at the indentation where her body had been hours earlier. The mark of her absence. I could almost see her lying there, scrolling on her phone, humming under her breath, glancing at me with that half-smile she knew could melt me. How many of those smiles had been lies? How many nights had I mistaken indifference for affection? I turned away before the memory could take root again. Memories were dangerous. They softened the edges, dulled the blade. And I needed my blade sharp. Back in the living room, I lowered myself into the chair. The glass in my hand had become an extension of me, steady, controlled, unshakable. I thought of her now, at that apartment. How she might have hesitated at his door, wondering if this was truly the freedom she wanted. How he might have welcomed her in, smug, certain of his victory. The image should have filled me with rage. But instead, it lit something colder in my chest. Anticipation. Because every touch she gave him was one she couldn't take back. Every kiss was a step deeper into a place I controlled, whether she realized it or not. She thought this was her choice. That she had taken the wheel, steered our lives into her hands. But I was the road. I was the direction. And she was simply driving where I allowed her to go. The clock ticked on. Each second a reminder that time was working for me, not against me. By the time she returned, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or shed a tear. She'd expect confrontation, maybe even forgiveness. But what she'd find instead was silence sharp enough to cut. That silence would be my weapon. My patience, my restraint, my refusal to give her the satisfaction of knowing the depth of my thoughts. Let her squirm in it. Let her drown in it. The more she tried to explain, the less I would say. The more she sought guilt in my eyes, the more she'd find nothing but stillness. And stillness terrifies people more than screams ever could. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, and studied the ceiling. The shadows above me stretched like veins, crawling across the plaster, pulsing with each heartbeat. There was power in this moment. The kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. Because the truth was simple, I had stopped being her husband tonight. I had become her mirror. And soon, she would see herself reflected in Mugli, twisted, exposed. I rose one final time, walked to the window, and looked out into the night. The street was empty, still, waiting. So was I. And when she finally returned, dragging her suitcase back across the threshold, pretending nothing had changed, she would learn the truth. She would see that the man she left behind in this house was not the man she would find waiting. She thought she had tested me. She thought she had won. But she never saw what I had planned waiting back home. The morning after didn't feel like morning at all. The sun was up, but its light came through the blinds in slanted, hostile beams that carved the room into sharp pieces. The air felt stale, as if the house had been holding its breath all night, waiting for me to move. I hadn't slept. I'd let the hours bleed into each other, sitting in that chair until the sky outside turned from black to gray to pale blue. The body begs for rest after a night like that, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Clear. Focused. The house was different now. It wasn't ours anymore. It was mine. I rose slowly, joints aching from stillness, and began to walk. The floorboards creaked under my feet, familiar sounds that suddenly felt amplified, purposeful. Every noise mattered. Every echo was part of the performance to come. In the hallway, the pictures still lay face down where I'd left them the night before. I stopped, staring at the scattered frames. Her smile pressed into the table, hidden from view. My smile too, erased by my own hand. I bent down, picked one up, and turned it over. Her eyes looked back at me, frozen in a moment that had once been pure. Sunlight in her hair, laughter in her mouth. I held the frame for a long time, then pressed it flat against my chest. A whisper of temptation crossed my mind. Set it upright again, pretend it still meant something. But I crushed that thought before it could grow. I turned the picture back over and placed it face down once more. Not hers anymore. Not ours anymore. The house belonged to me now. And if she ever stepped back through that door, she'd find it had been remade in my image. The cleaning began not with soap and water, but with silence. I moved through the rooms, stripping them of her presence. Clothes left draped on chairs were folded and hidden away. Shoes at the door were placed neatly in the closet, tucked behind mine. It wasn't cleaning. It was erasure. Every trace of her was either turned face down, locked away, or repositioned. A sweater folded into a drawer she rarely opened. Her jewelry box slid under the bed, out of sight. The perfume bottle I'd packed for her last night, her favorite, the one she wore on the evenings she wanted to be noticed, now sat on the bathroom counter, cap unscrewed, its scent spilling into the air like a ghost that wouldn't leave. The smell followed me as I moved, clinging to me, clawing into my lungs. But I didn't cover it. I wanted it there. A reminder. An echo of what I was stripping away. By the time I reached the hallway drawer, my hands were steady. Too steady. I slid it open slowly, like peeling back skin, and looked at the pile inside. Letters. Photographs. Little mementos she thought I never touched. Last night, I had only brushed them with my fingers. Tonight, I pulled them out one by one, laying them on the table like evidence. A ticket stub. A folded note, creased from being opened too many times. A photograph of the two of them together, her younger, eyes brighter, his arm around her waist like he owned her. I stared at that picture for a long time. Not at him. At her. The way she leaned into him, as though she belonged nowhere else. The way her smile reached all the way to her eyes, the same smile that had faded when she looked at me these past few years. A flicker of heat pulsed in my chest, but I didn't let it bloom into rage. Rage was a fire that burned out too quickly. I needed ice. Patience. I stacked the letters neatly, tied them with a rubber band, and placed them back in the drawer. Not destroyed. Not discarded. No, these weren't trash. These were tools. She had thought hiding them gave her power. But she was wrong. Every secret she thought she owned was already mine. It's strange how the mind sharpens when it has purpose. As I moved through the house, memories surfaced, moments I had ignored before, now illuminated with cruel clarity. I remembered the first time I caught her looking at her phone too long, her lips parting as if she'd forgotten where she was. She had claimed it was work, of course. A late-night email, a demanding client. I'd believed her. I remembered the party where he had shown up unexpectedly. The way her body stiffened when she saw him, her smile faltering before she forced it back. She'd said later it was nothing. Just surprise. And I remembered the night she had slipped his name into conversation, casual, careless, as if she wasn't aware of the tenderness in her tone. She had laughed it off when I noticed. Said I was imagining things. I hadn't imagined any of it. I had simply refused to see. And that was the real betrayal, not hers, but mine. I had betrayed myself by choosing blindness over truth. Not anymore. By midday, the house no longer felt like the place we had shared. It was sterile, stripped, prepared. Her belongings were either hidden, locked, or inverted. Control. That was the word echoing in my mind as I worked. Control of the objects, control of the space, control of the story itself. I wasn't erasing her completely. No. That would have been too merciful. Instead, I was disassembling her presence piece by piece, until the house no longer reflected her but reminded her of her absence. Every photo turned face down was a reminder of what she had abandoned. Every drawer locked was a reminder of what she no longer owned. Every empty chair was a stage waiting for her to sit in and feel the silence press against her throat. She had thought she was free when she walked into his arms last night. But freedom without ground beneath you is just falling. And I had already taken away the ground. The final act of the day was ritual. I pulled the suitcase, the same one I had packed for her the night before, out of the trunk of my car. I set it in the middle of the living room, upright, zipped, untouched. It sat there like a monument, a reminder of her choice. When she came back, she would see it immediately. Maybe she would think I hadn't moved it because I expected her return. Maybe she would believe it meant forgiveness, another chance. But it wasn't forgiveness. It was bait. The suitcase was not hers anymore. It was mine. And soon, she would understand the difference. The house had been stripped, rearranged, and muted, but something was still missing. Control is not only in the objects you hide, but in the words you choose to leave behind. I sat at the dining table with a blank sheet of paper before me. My hand hovered over it, pen gripped too tightly, veins showing at the wrist. The silence of the room pressed against me, waiting to hear what I would say. I began to write. The first words came slow, deliberate, like drops of water falling into a deep well. You wanted freedom. The pen scratched the page, each letter etched with precision. I'll give you truth. I paused, reading the line again. The words looked harmless on their own, stripped of context. But that was the beauty of them. The meaning was in the silence between the lines. I continued, writing not a confession, not a threat, but something in between. A series of fragments, each one carefully chosen to unsettle. You left me with silence. Now the silence belongs to me. You chose a path, but the ground beneath you is gone. Every secret you hid was already mine. I wrote them as if they were facts, not accusations. Facts have weight. They cannot be argued with. When I was done, I folded the paper neatly, slid it into an envelope, and left it on the corner of the dining table. Not in the centerno, that would have been too obvious. The corner made it seem like an afterthought, something she might discover by accident. Accidents are always more powerful than declarations. The knock came that afternoon. A sharp, hollow sound that sliced through the silence like a blade. My heart stuttered once, then steadied. I moved slowly to the door, each step measured, careful. Through the peephole, a distorted shape, a neighbor, holding a package. I opened the door just enough to take it, my smile practiced, polite. I thanked them, exchanged the bare minimum of words, then shut the door again. For a moment, I stood there in the hallway, holding the package, the world outside pressing against the door like a storm trying to seep in. But the storm couldn't enter. Not here. Not in the house I had sealed. I set the package aside without opening it. Its contents didn't matter. What mattered was the reminder that the outside world still existed, still expected me to play the part of the husband, the neighbor, the man who lived a normal life. I could play that part when necessary. But inside these walls, I was something else entirely. The preparation continued. I moved to the dining room, clearing the table with slow, deliberate care. The wood gleamed under the light, polished and bare. Then I began to set it. Plates. Glasses. Silverware. Each piece placed with mathematical precision, aligned with the edges of the tablecloth, symmetrically arranged. I adjusted the angle of the knives and forks until they reflected the light just so. It wasn't dinner I was preparing. It was a stage. The envelope with the letter sat on the corner, unassuming, almost invisible against the wood. But I knew her eyes would find it. They always had a way of finding the things I didn't want her to see. I placed a candle in the center of the table, unlit. Then I dimmed the lights until shadows pooled in the corners of the room. From the hallway, the suitcase stood upright, a sentinel watching over the stage. And in that moment, the house was ready. I sat in the living room as the light outside faded, listening to the house breathe. The creaks of the floorboards. The hum of the refrigerator. The faint ticking of the clock in the hall. All of it wove together into a rhythm, a pulse. The house was alive, waiting with me. And as I waited, my mind began to unfold. This wasn't about love. Not anymore. Love was soft, pliable, weak. Love bends until it breaks. This wasn't about hate either. Hate is loud, messy, uncontrolled. It consumes the one who feels it. No, what I felt was something sharper. Clarity. She had thought she was clever, hiding pieces of herself in drawers, behind words, in the pauses between conversations. She thought her secrets gave her power. But secrets are cages. And the cruel truth is that most people build their own cages and call it freedom. She had locked herself in long before I ever touched the key. And now, I was simply showing her the bars. The night pressed in. The shadows deepened. I remained seated, still, my body a statue carved into the armchair. Every detail of the house had been prepared. Every piece of her presence erased, inverted, or staged. The photographs lay face down. The letters hidden in the drawer. The suitcase standing like a sentinel. The letter waiting on the corner of the table. She would return eventually. They always do. Not because of love, but because the silence outside is never as kind as the silence inside. When she walked back through that door, she wouldn't find the home she left. She would find the stage I had built, every detail chosen to remind her of what she had given up, what she could never reclaim. And I would be waiting, silent, patient, inevitable. The candle on the table caught a glimmer of the streetlight outside, its wax pale and waiting. I didn't light it. I didn't need to. Light is for warmth. For comfort. For hope. And hope was not something I intended to offer. She thought she'd left me behind last night. But what she really left was herself. The key turned in the lock more slowly than usual. It was a small detail, but I noticed it instantly. She paused for just a second before pushing the door open, as if the house itself resisted her entry. The door creaked on its hinges, the sound carrying through the darkened hall like a warning. I sat in the living room, silent, motionless, my body pressed into the armchair's shadows. The only light came from the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds, cutting the room into stripes of shadow and pale gold. Her footsteps crossed the threshold. Hesitant. Not the casual rhythm of someone coming home, but the careful steps of a trespasser. She stopped. I didn't have to see her face to know what had caught her attention. The suitcase. It stood in the hallway exactly where I had placed it, upright, zipped, untouched. A sentinel waiting for her. For a long moment, there was no sound but the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then her hand brushed the handle of the suitcase. The wheel scraped softly against the floor as she pulled it a few inches toward her, then stopped. I imagined her expression, the confusion, the unease blooming behind her eyes. She hadn't expected to see it there. She had expected it to be gone, packed away, erased like an embarrassing mistake. But mistakes are never erased. They linger. They wait. She let go of the suitcase and moved deeper into the house. Her heels clicked softly against the wood, echoing unnaturally loud in the silence I had cultivated. She hesitated again when she reached the dining room. I didn't need to follow. I knew exactly what she was seeing. The table, perfectly set. Plates, glasses, silverware arranged with surgical precision. Shadows bending across the surface. And the envelope. It sat on the corner of the table, folded neatly, plain and unmarked. A piece of nothing. But her eyes would find it. They always did. I listened to her breathing quicken as she approached. The faint rustle of paper as her hands unfolded the letter. A silence longer than any scream followed. I imagined her eyes scanning the lines. You wanted freedom. I'll give you truth. You left me with silence. Now the silence belongs to me. Every secret you hid was already mine. The words weren't threats. They weren't accusations. They were simple statements of fact. And facts, when placed in the right light, can be more suffocating than any chain. Finally, I spoke. You found it. The words came from the shadows behind her. Calm. Quiet. A scalpel sliding across skin. She jumped, nearly dropping the letter, then turned sharply toward the living room. I didn't move. I let her eyes search the darkness until they found me, sitting in the armchair, still, deliberate. Her voice wavered, fragile but trying to hold firm. What is this? I tilted my head slightly, letting the silence stretch before answering. It's clarity. She looked back at the letter, then at the table, then at me. Confusion flickered across her face, followed quickly by fear. Why are you doing this? She whispered. I leaned forward, letting the dim light touch my face. My voice stayed calm, almost conversational. You left me silence. I've only given it back. She stared at me, her lips parting as if to argue, then pressing closed again. Her eyes darted back to the suitcase in the hallway, then to the letter still trembling in her hands. This isn't normal, she stammered. You're scaring me. I let the words hang in the air, untouched. Then I asked the first question, the first move in the game. Why do you think the suitcase is still there? She blinked, startled. What? I repeated, slowly, precisely. Why do you think I left it there? She shook her head, defensive. I don't know. Maybe because you wanted me to see it? To guilt me? I smiled faintly, though it didn't touch my eyes. Interesting. You didn't take it when you left. You walked away without it. Why? Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. I didn't need it. I wasn't leaving forever. I just needed space. Space, I echoed softly. And what did you find there? In that space? She flinched at the question, as though I had reached inside her chest and pulled something raw into the open. You're twisting things, she said sharply, her voice breaking. I leaned back into the shadows again, my tone still even. Am I? Or are you just afraid of the answers? Her breath hitched. She looked down at the letter again, gripping it too tightly, the paper beginning to crumple. I rose slowly from the armchair. Not sudden, not aggressive, just deliberate enough for the weight of the movement to press against her. Her eyes followed me as I crossed the room, my steps measured, echoing against the floorboards. I walked past her, past the table, into the hallway. The drawer. I opened it with care, the wood groaning softly. I reached inside, pulled out the stack of letters and photographs bound neatly with a rubber band. I turned back to her, holding them in my hands. Her face drained of color. I walked back to the table and set them down gently between us. She froze, staring at the bundle as though it might burn her if she touched it. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. You went through my things." I sat down across from her, folding my hands calmly on the table. "They were never yours." Her eyes snapped to mine, wide with shock. "What are you talking about?" "Of course they were mine. They're personal." They were his," I interrupted softly. "And then you brought them here. Into this house. Into our life. Once you crossed that threshold, they weren't yours anymore. They became mine. Just like every secret you thought you hid." She shook her head violently, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. "You're insane. This isn't healthy, this isn't." "Healthy," I repeated, almost amused. "Is hiding parts of yourself and pretending they don't exist healthy? Is splitting your life between two shadows healthy?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. The silence stretched, long and heavy, until she finally dropped her gaze to the floor. And I knew I had won the first move. She tried to regain control by speaking faster, louder words thrown like flares into the dark. "Why are you doing this? You're hurting me. This isn't you." She reached for the obvious defenses: anger, accusation, denial. They were what people use when they believe a fight can be won with volume. But volume is a blunt instrument. It doesn't work in a room where silence has been sharpened into an edge. I let her talk. Let her assemble her arguments. Each sentence she spat out I listened to as if cataloging specimens. When she finished, breathless and ragged, I didn't answer immediately. I folded my hands on the table and regarded her like a man reading an old book whose ending he already knew. "You keep saying things are not me," I said finally. My voice was soft, almost curious. "But who decided what you are? You call yourself free, and then you return with a suitcase you didn't take. You call your choices brave, and yet you hide paper and photos in drawers. You claim honesty and still name him like it's nothing." She swallowed. "You're twisting." "Am I?" I interrupted, not loud, just precise. "Or am I simply pointing out the inconsistencies you've always refused to reconcile? You left tonight, yesterday, the first time you let him back into your life, and you expect me to react like a man caught off guard. But you underestimate me. I remember everything." She flinched as though struck. "You remember? You remember then why you never asked? Why you let things sit? There it was, the old defense. Turn the light back on someone else's guilt. Make them answer for your choices." I leaned forward, the candlelight catching the planes of my face. "Because I wanted to believe," I said. "But believing is not seeing. And tonight, I chose to see." Silence folded in between us. She tried to fill it, pleading, bargaining, then anger, but each of her words only left the edges of her story ragged and visible. She began to contradict herself in quick, small ways. A slip intense, a hesitation that became a confession. The more she spoke, the more of herself she revealed. "That was the way I meant it to be. You always said you needed space," I said, tilting my head. "Space to think, to breathe. What if what you wanted wasn't space at all? What if you wanted permission to be someone other than the person in our photographs?" My hand hovered near the envelope, but I didn't touch it. No theatrics. Just the suggestion of motion. Her skin flushed, heat rising to the neck. "That's cruel," she whispered. "You're being cruel. You promised." Her voice broke and she looked away, toward a framed photo face down on the sideboard. The sight of its miles turned to the wall seemed to unbalance her in a new way. I rose then, slow, controlled, and traversed the room to the candle. I cupped my hand around the match like a priest with a relic and struck. The flame came alive, thin and whispering. I brought it to the wick and let it bloom. The candle guttered at first, then steadied, throwing a small golden pool across the table. The flame changed the room. Shadows lengthened, the folds of her dress darkened, the whites of her eyes shone brighter. The world had narrowed to the circle of light between us. Light and the things it reveals. You see how small that flame is? I asked softly. Yet it changes everything. I set my chair back down and watched her watch the flame. You think leaving him was about size or courage? It isn't. It's about consequence. Every small thing you doth secrets, the stolen messages, the soft smiles adds up. And night by night, they build a pattern. You called it freedom. I call it history. And history can be shown, line by line. She laughed then, a sound that was more a crack than mirth. You're insane. This is insane. How could you go through my things? This is an invasion. I looked at her steadily. You invaded us first, I said. If taking the things that lived in a drawer feels like invasion, perhaps you should ask why those things lived there at all. My hand rested on the edge of the table, fingers splayed. The rubber band-bound stack of letters lay between us like a provocation. Her composure frayed. Tears pressed at the corners of her eyes. She reached for a defense I had already folded into my hands, the claim that she had been weak, that love had been complicated, that his presence had been from a past she'd already buried. Her voice stumbled through explanations, fumbling for absolution. Every time she offered a reason, would nod slowly and then ask only one follow-up, and did you tell me? That question was a knife disguised as curiosity. She could not answer without revealing more than she intended. Hours seemed to condense as she sat across from me, tight, contained, shrinking. She began to repeat herself, circling the same excuses like an exhausted animal circling a trap. I knew the moment she realized words would no longer save her. It was the small, almost imperceptible slump in the shoulders, the way her jaw went slack. She tried one last maneuver. Please, she said. Please, we can go to counseling. We can, she swallowed hard. We can fix this. I watched her hands twist the edge of the paper into a crescent. Fix it? I echoed. Fix what? That you slipped into another life and called it breathing? Her cheeks flushed with angry shame. You make it sound so easy. As if I didn't feel the strangling too. You did feel it, I acknowledged. And you fled into something familiar. I tapped the bundle with a fingertip. Familiar absolves a person from the work of being honest. It's comfortable. Safe. And comfortable things taste like surrender. Her breathing accelerated. She looked as if she might stand, might run, might try to take the suitcase and flee into the night with the same clumsy hope that left her last night. But there was the suitcase, rigid and upright in the hall, immovable, a mute testimony to the choice she had made and then been unwilling to complete. She stepped toward it on unsteady knees, hand outstretched. If I leave, she began. Her voice sounded very small. If you leave, I said, and the words were not unkind, merely precise, you will take with you only what you can carry. But the truth will stay. The house will remember. And people remember more than names. They remember patterns. Leaving without facing patterns is running. And running gives you only an escape without change. She stopped, fingers hovering above the handle. The metal glittered pale in the candlelight, and for a moment, her hand trembled as if unsure whether to close around it. She looked back at me, eyes raw. You can't keep doing this, control me like this. This is manipulation. Her voice rose on the last word, an accusation that sounded like a plea. Manipulation is when a person lies to themselves and others to avoid consequences, I said. This is excavation. I'm simply sifting through the layers you built and showing you what's underneath. I let that word hang, excavation. It had the patience of geology. It suggested time, pressure, the slow revealing of strata. She sank back into the chair, defeated for a moment, and then rage flared sharp, jagged, useless. "You're cruel," she spat. "You think you're righteous, but you're hollow." "Hollow?" I repeated. "Perhaps. Hollow people do not set traps for others. Hollow people do not tidy photographs and prepare tables. Hollow people cannot wait. I can." The fury burned itself out quickly. She had nothing left to throw. She realized then that shouts and accusations found no purchase on me. My calm was not emptiness but a wall. A barrier she could not breach with yelling or weeping. It was containment. It was a slow pressure that forced truth to surface like oil in water. Her shoulders bowed. Tears spilled over now, not theatrical but honest. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered again, smaller. I leaned forward and placed both hands on the table, the candle between them like a small sun. "Because you wanted to test me tonight," I said, voice near and steady. "You wanted to know if I would break. I didn't. So now you must choose. Do you shrink from the light or step into it?" She stared at the flame as if it were a riddle. The silence that followed was thicker than any argument had been. She could run, yes. She could stay, yes. Each choice had calculations attached, social, legal, emotional, and she felt the weight of them like pebbles in her pockets. Finally, she whispered, almost inaudible, "What do you want from me?" I tilted my head and smiled, not cruelly, not warmly, just the faintest curve at the corner of the mouth that suggested certainty. "Truth," I said. "Honesty. A narrative you no longer get to edit behind closed doors." She closed her eyes. For a heartbeat, I thought she might crumble. Then she opened them and looked at me, hollowed, exposed. She had become suddenly small in the space between the candlelight and the dark. My voice dropped to a near whisper. "Your move." The words sat in the air like a verdict. The candle continued to burn, patient and indifferent, as if it had always known the rules of the game. She looked at the envelope, at the suitcase, at the photographs, and then back at me, trembling with the knowledge that whatever she chose next would not be only hers to carry. When she came back, she did not come in with the gait of someone seeking absolution. There was none of that theatrical remorse people sometimes bring, the late-night apologies, the bouquets, the confessionals arranged like props. She came with the shaky bravado of someone who had tried a new life on for size and found it either ill-fitting or heavier than she expected. Either way, she returned. The lock turned with a different rhythm this time. There was a stiffness in her shoulders as she stepped over the threshold, a measured breath she seemed to take before letting the door close, as if she had to decide how much of herself to let inside. I was in the kitchen. I had not been waiting in the chair all day like a statue. That would have been too obvious. I had moved through the house, tidying not for show but for effect, smoothing a misplaced napkin, angling a magazine so the spine aligned with the edge of the coffee table, placing a coaster where a glass would be set. Little calibrations, tiny impressions meant to suggest order, control, a life that was unruffled by midnight departures. She hesitated as she crossed the living room, eyes flicking to the photographs turned face down and then to the suitcase standing in the hallway. Her hand hovered near the handle as if she might pick it up and leave in one fluid motion. She didn't. She set her keys on the sideboard and folded her hands together, an involuntary gesture of trying to compose herself. "You're home," I said, voice neutral. Not a greeting, not a question. A statement of fact. She gave a small, brittle laugh that sounded like someone testing whether glass could still hold weight. "Yes. I came back." There was an attempt at normalcy in the way she said it, an offering of the ordinary, dinner, television, routine. But the ordinary had been rearranged into something else weeks ago. Ordinary no longer applied. I poured a cup of tea and held it for a moment, the steam fogging the rim. The small domestic image, 2 mugs, a low hum of shared space was a trick I allowed myself. People expect tea. People think it suggests care. In my hands, it became a prop in a larger scene. You look tired, I said, and set the cup down on the counter with the precision of a metronome. She blinked. Travel, lack of sleep. Things happened. I nodded as if that summary explained everything, and for a moment she might have believed that my nod meant pardon. It did not. My nod was a book closing softly. The room had changed the day she left, nothing I said could restore it. She moved to the sofa and sat. She did not collapse into it with relief but perched on the edge, as if ready to spring. She kept glancing at the table, at the envelope, at the photograph turned away. The house was a conversation she was trying to navigate without any script. "Do you want something to eat?" I asked. Beneath the surface, the question had a calculus. Would she accept? Would that acceptance be a request for forgiveness, or simply an attempt to return to the banal? Her answer would tell me something. "No," she said quickly. "I'm fine." She lied by omission, the small, quiet sort of lie people tell when they want to appear steady without admitting weakness. It was edible. It was telling. I sat opposite her, an arm's length away, choosing distance with intent. Proximity can be a weapon if used well. I wanted her to feel the space between us. I watched her hands as she folded them in her lap and then unclasped them, as if measuring the nerves that still trembled. The seat creaked with every micro-movement, the house recorded the details like a witness. "You read the letter?" I asked. Her face flickered. She gave a small nod, the kind you see in people who have swallowed something bitter and must force a neutral expression. "Yes." And it's blunt." She crossed her legs, tightened her jaw. "You could have called. Talked. This setup." "Setup," I echoed, letting the word hang thinly in the air. "Do you think it was designed merely to punish you?" She hesitated. The question was a snare because each answer carried admission. "I don't know what I think. I am just trying to figure out what it is that you want." "Truth," I said, as if it were obvious. "I want to know what your truth is. Not what you hand me at midnight washed in niceties. Not the version you give when words are safer. I want the raw version." She made a small sound that could have been a laugh or a sob and then steadied herself. "You always make everything sound so simple," she said. "As if truth could be laid out like plates on a table." "That's not what I said," I answered. "Truth is not simple. It's granular. It is a sum of tiny things like the postcards you never mentioned, the messages you deleted, the glances that lasted longer than they should. Put together, they are the story you don't tell." Her face flushed as if heat were seeping from her skin. "You're humiliating me," she whispered. I looked at her without expression. "I'm illuminating history. Some people call that cruelty. Others call it necessary work." The words were clinical, they removed judgment and turned the moment into an objective observation. She stilled, trying to gather the right defense. For a moment she looked younger, as if the fatigue had thinned the skin and revealed the girl beneath not yet practiced in the art of strategic omission. It was a striking look, and for a second something like pity flickered in me. I smothered it quickly. Pity would complicate the clarity. "You could have told me," she said finally. "You could have asked instead of." Her voice tapered off. I held up a hand. "Questions are cheap. They can be answered in ways that soothe the asker." I wanted more than that. I paused, tasting the sentence. "I wanted to see whether you would choose to be honest when the comforts of the old life were removed." She looked at me, searching for a crack, for the man she had once known who would fall to pieces. Tears, anger, desperation. There was none. She wanted to see misery, she found calm. Calm is a different kind of weapon than fury. Fury consumes. Calm endures. "You're not the man I married," she said. The accusation was soft, but it had heat enough to register. No, I agreed. I am what I need to be now. The words carried no apology. They were an admission and a declaration at once. She stared at the envelope, at the unread edges, and then finally reached for it as if compelled. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. She read slowly, the lines moving like little weights dropping into a glass. With each line, the expression folding over her face became harder to categorize: shame, regret, calculation, defense, elements that said more in aggregation than any single word could. "I can't do this in public," she murmured when she finished. Her voice was shaken. "What you're doing, this isn't fair." "Fairness is not my metric," I said. "Honesty is." She crumpled the paper slightly and then smoothed it with trembling fingers. She almost laughed, a brittle sound. "Honesty would have been if you'd told me. Not this theater." "Theater," I repeated, a small smile ghosting the corner of my mouth. "Do you remember when we used to go to the theater? You liked the lights off. You liked the safety of darkness to hide in." I sat back, watching the memory become a mirror. "You are comfortable in the half-light, not the full beam." She bore the comparison like a wound. "So what now?" she whispered. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at her. "Now we see how committed you are to the life you say you want. Do you want to be honest enough to risk losing what you hope to keep? Or do you want to keep the warmth of denial?" The question was not rhetorical. I wanted an answer, and I intended to hold her to it. She screwed up her face as if to propel the words out. I wanted space to think. And in thinking, you found him." "In thinking, I found something that felt like breathing," she corrected, her voice rising slightly. "Breathing is not living," I said quietly. "People confuse the two." The sentence landed between us like a gavel. She stared at me as if trying to measure the weight of it. She looked small then, diminished not by anything I had done but by the recognition that her carefully curated freedoms had consequences. She had expected me to unravel, to beg, to rage. Instead she met a stillness that would not bow. For the first time in the evening, she seemed to consider leaving. Not the impulsive, dramatic exit of last night, but a quiet, deliberate departure, as one might step out of a room they decided no longer fit them. She rose, fingers grazing the suitcase. "Will you come?" I asked. She looked over her shoulder as if considering whether to run back to a life that had thrown her some necessary oxygen. "No," she said. I don't know." "Then sit," I said. "Or leave. But decide." My words were not a trap, they were boundaries. She had asked for space. Space demands decisions when the echo returns. She sank back onto the couch reluctantly. The night pressed against the windows like a patient audience. "I don't want us to be a project," she said finally, softer. "I don't want us to be someone's experiment." "You already turned us into an experiment when you chose not to be honest," I said. That was the first alteration. My voice held neither bitterness nor triumph, merely the steady logic of a man cataloging observations. Her eyes dropped to the photograph face down on the sideboard. The sight of it seemed to cause her pain. I watched the way her fingers twitched. She was calculating whether a narrative could be revised or whether some things, once revealed, could never be folded back into the old life. There was a long silence. The kind that sits in the center of living rooms and refuses the small talk that used to be the glue of evenings. Outside, a car went by, the headlights momentarily lighting the curtain. Inside, the air felt thick with choices. "Finally," she said, voice small and tentative, "why are you doing this to me?" I answered plainly. "Because I need to know who I live with. Because I need to know whether honesty is part of the life we continue to inhabit or whether I was simply sharing space with a person who needed another kind of life." Her jaw tightened. Tears welled again, but this time there was also a spark of something like defiance. So what do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That I made a mistake? That will fix it? No, I said. I don't want words. I want context. I want to understand the pattern. I want to know if you will choose transparency when it costs you comfort. She folded inward on the couch, the motion of someone putting on a coat that was too heavy. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I could see the internal calculus: what to say, what to omit, which small deceptions would preserve her image and comfort. The light above us hummed faintly. Time thinned into the space between heartbeats. I let her dip into silence for a long moment, letting whatever decision brew in her to surface. When she finally spoke, it was small and honest in a way that made the air contact my skin differently. I don't want to lose everything, she said. But I don't know if I can live without him. The confession was not theatrical, it was bone deep and hopelessly true. It was the kind of admission that either opens a wound to heal or shows a fracture that can never be mended. I listened. I stored the words like a specimen, precise, catalogued. They would be useful. They would be consequential. They would change the map of our life. I said nothing for a long time, then finally offered, "You have to choose, and you have to live with the consequences." She stared at me, eyes wide and unsparing. In that gaze I saw the moment she understood that the house, the stage, the envelopes, the photographs, all of it was designed not to shame but to reveal. She realized she had been playing a game with a man who no longer played to lose. She curled her hands into her lap, and for the first time that night, her posture looked resigned rather than defiant. The room hummed. The clock ticked. The house listened. When she spoke again, it was as if each syllable cost her something. "I don't know if I can give you what you want," she admitted. "I don't know if I can stop thinking about him." Her confession landed like a stone. The echo of it would carry further than either of us wanted. I nodded slowly. "Then decide," I said. "Before the next small thing becomes an inevitability." She looked at me, really looked, as if trying to weigh whether the man across from her had become a stranger or an embodiment of truth. Either way, the choice was hers to make. For the first time since she had returned, a shadow of fear crossed her face. Not for the outcome, but for the clarity that choice demanded. The night stretched. Outside, the distant sound of life went on. Inside, the house seemed to settle into a brittle watchfulness. She inhaled, then exhaled, a long slow deflation. "I need time," she whispered. "Then take it," I said. "But know this, time is not an ally if you plan only to delay. It simply reveals." Her eyes darted to the suitcase, then to the photograph, then back at me. She had asked for room to breathe. Now I had given her oxygen and asked her to choose how she would inhale. She left the couch then, moving with the uncertain gait of someone stepping toward a precipice. She stood for a moment by the doorway, hand on the frame, as if measuring whether to step through. Finally she said, "I'll sleep in the guest room." That was not a return to the old life. It was not reconciliation. It was an interim, a buffer. A place where decisions can be delayed and consequences softened. I watched her move down the hall. The house took her in silently. The night carried her footsteps like a rumor. When she was gone, I sat for a long while, feeling the aftershock of the confession like a low current. The gears had moved. The board had been reset. The pieces were shifting into place. For the first time, the game had become two players playing for stakes neither of us could yet imagine. The guest room was small and efficient, the bed made with an almost indifferent neatness. She had chosen it like a person choosing to sleep in a lifeboat rather than their ship, a temporary refuge meant to distance rather than reconcile. I didn't follow. That would have been petty. Instead, I walked back through the living room and paused at the sideboard where the photographs lay, faces turned away from the world. I picked one up, felt the weight of laminated memory in my hands. For a fleeting second, I allowed the ghost of an old tenderness to pass through me. It was brief, like light through a shutter. Then I set the frame down face down again and walked to the kitchen. There was work to be done. Not the physical tidy-ups that interested tidy people, but the archival kind: notes, records, things to file and remember. I sat at the table and opened a notebook, uncapped a pen, and began to write. I wrote what she had said earlier, the admission about not knowing if she could live without him. I wrote the exact phrasing: "I don't know if I can stop thinking about him." The sentence felt heavier on the page than it had sounded when she spoke it. It was a hinge. People underestimate how precise language can be when it becomes evidence. I underlined the line twice and closed the notebook. Facts once written acquire a permanence that oral assurances rarely do. The house hummed with the same dense quiet. In the living room, the envelope lay where she had left it, a small, unremarked object that had rearranged the axis of our night. I picked it up and slid it under the notebook. A marker, a signpost. Proof that someone had once attempted to domesticate truth with paper and pen. I moved through the rooms, checking small things. A light left on in a bathroom. A cup in the sink. Polishing the echoes of normalcy. My actions were careful, unshowy, a man cataloging the remnants of what had been and preparing for the next move. I thought about the letters, the photographs hidden in that drawer. Each item felt like a small weapon and a plea, both proofs of a life half-lived and reminders of choices considered and rejected. They were not ammunition for violence. They were tools for unspooling a narrative. I intended to use them as evidence in the court of our daily lives, to prove not guilt in a legal sense but a pattern in a moral one. When she returned to the living room later, robes wrapped around her, hair loose and damp from a quick shower, her eyes held a new hardness. She moved with an economy that suggested she had been rehearsing words in the mirror. Her defenses were reassembled differently. She had taken stock overnight and re-entered the space like a woman who had adjusted her armor. "How are you sleeping?" I asked casually. She didn't flinch. "Well enough." "Do you plan to leave?" I probed. She looked at me, and for a moment there was a flash of anger. "Do you want me to?" "It's not my desire," I said. "It's a question of fact. If you plan to stay, tell me. If you plan to walk away, tell me. The ambiguity is the thing I cannot live with." She studied me then and let out a small, dry laugh that held equal parts defiance and fatigue. "You make it sound so stark," she said. "As if I can't both stay and feel other things at the same time." "You can," I conceded. "But either we rebuild with honesty or we continue on lines of omission. There is no neutral." Her jaw hardened. "So this is an ultimatum?" "It is a question," I corrected. "Ultimatums are easy. They are also often performative. This is not performative. This is necessary." She sat at the table opposite me, folding her hands as if to pray. The house watched. The photographs remained face down, the suitcase a reminder in the hall. The candle on the dining table, unlit now, seemed almost prophetic in its potential. She leaned forward, speaking in a lower voice. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said. "I never wanted to hurt you." "You say that," I said. "But what matters more is whether you are willing to change the architecture of your life. Words without change are like empty rooms. They sound hollow." She paused, then allowed herself an honesty that was rawer than what she had given before. "I don't know if I can just stop thinking about him, but I don't want to destroy our life either." "Then what do you want?" I asked. "To be honest, or to keep pretending?" She sat back, overwhelmed by the scale of the question. "I want both," she said quietly, the contradiction plain as glass. "That's not a sentence that holds weight," I replied. "It's a wish. Wishes are not plans." She bit her lip and then said, with slow, deliberate care, "I'm willing to try. I don't know if I can be successful, but I'm willing to attempt it." The admission was skeletal and brave in its way. Commitment is often ugly, a mixture of half measures and stubbornness. Her willingness to attempt sounded like a truce negotiated from a position of weakness, but it was a start. I watched her then and thought about mercy. There is a cruelty in forcing confessions out of people and an equal cruelty in refusing to accept their fragile attempts at repair. I had to be careful about which kind of man I would become, the one who breaks or the one who tests too mercilessly. Try, I said finally. But understand what trying means. Trying means transparency. Trying means that when you are tempted, you tell me. It means when you think about leaving, you admit it to me instead of acting on it. It means we are accountable. She nodded slowly. I can do that, she whispered, with the fragile conviction of someone stepping onto a narrow ledge. Then we will proceed like that, I said. But if you choose not to be honest, then the house will no longer be a home. It will be an archive. She swallowed. What happens if I can't do it? She asked. Then you leave, I said simply. We separate. There is dignity in choosing the life you cannot change rather than staying in a lie. The gravity of that statement settled over her like a mantle. She had expected entreaties, bargains, pleas. She had not expected the clear-eyed terms of a man who had catalogued his options and was prepared to enact them. She closed her eyes briefly, the fight draining from her. When she opened them, there was a solemnity to her expression. Then I will try, she said. It was not a triumphant victory, it was the beginning of an uneasy treaty. We both knew the terms could break at any moment, but the agreement existed in the tension between us nonetheless. We spent the next hours speaking in measured ways about boundaries and small practicalities, passwords, access to accounts, who would handle the finances if she left. The mundane logistics were a relief in their blankness. Paperwork is a poor foil for passion but a strong one for structure. When the night finally eased, she slept in the guest room as promised. I closed the door behind me, went to the living room, and turned the faces of the photographs up one by one, as if testing whether the world reflected in them would still stand. They looked the same and yet changed, like a photograph in which the color saturation had shifted slightly. The faces were familiar but not identical to memory. The house carried the weight of a new truth, that decisions had been made in the open, that the scaffolding of our life was now visible. I sat at the kitchen table and opened another notebook. Tonight we had agreed on a framework, a set of promises that required vigilance. I wrote the agreement down: transparency, boundaries, accountability, and then underlined the words. The night hummed. The house settled into a brittle quiet. Part of me felt victorious not from triumph over her but from gaining honesty. Another part of me, quieter and lonelier, catalogued the cost. Honesty is a thing that strips illusions. It leaves a rawness that requires tending. But tending is something people never learn until they have burned their hands. When the first gray of dawn crept at the edges of the curtains, I closed the notebook, flipped the photograph face down again for now, and stepped outside for air. The street was empty, and the world felt small and intimate under the pale morning light. She had returned. She had confessed. She had agreed to try. It was not victory. It was not defeat. It was merely the opening of a new phase whose shape I intended to define. I walked back inside, feeling the house as a living thing beneath my feet. The game continued. The rules had shifted, and with them, a new kind of danger, the danger of hope that is not yet earned. The candle had burned low. Its wax dripped in thick rivulets, cooling into pale ridges like scars across the polished wood. The air carried the faint tang of smoke, sweet and acrid, clinging to the curtains, our skin, even the silence itself. She had not spoken in a long time. Her eyes followed the shrinking wick as though waiting for it to gutter, as though its death might excuse her from choosing. But flames die slowly, and silence is more patient than both of us. I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of the moment stretch. The house seemed to hold its breath, listening. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world continued, cars, voices, the hum of a city that never stopped. But here, within this small circle of flickering light, time had contracted to a waiting room with no exit. "You think you've reached the worst of it," I said softly. "That the letters and photographs were the shape of your betrayal. But they were only the first layer." Her head jerked up, eyes sharp. "What do you mean?" I tapped a single finger against the envelope. Not to draw attention to its contents, those had already served their purpose, but to what they symbolized. Objects are never just objects. They are maps. They show where someone has been, what roads they've chosen to walk. But maps, I paused, do not tell you why someone walked them. She shifted in her seat, tension crackling across her shoulders. "You're playing with me again. Twisting words." "Am I?" I asked, tilting my head. "Or is it that you fear I've seen the why and not just the where?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. I rose slowly, deliberately, and crossed to the hall. My footsteps echoed softly, the rhythm deliberate, like a heartbeat in the dark. The suitcase waited by the door, upright and mute, a century of decisions half made. But I passed it without pause. My hand reached instead for the drawer of the sideboard, the one she never opened when I was home, the one she thought held nothing but spare candles and matches. The wood groaned faintly as it slid open. I could feel her gaze stabbing into my back. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice thin, brittle. I ignored her, reaching past the row of candles until my hand closed around the object I had hidden there days ago. Its surface was cold, metal against my skin, its edges sharp from long use. I drew it out and set it on the table between us with a soft, deliberate clink. A recorder. Small, black, unremarkable. The kind that fit easily into a pocket or a desk drawer. Her breath caught. "I told you," I said, lowering myself into the chair once more. "Objects are maps. And this one leads to a place you've been avoiding." She shook her head rapidly, almost violently. "No. No, you didn't." "I did." My voice cut through her denial like a scalpel. "For weeks, while you thought I was blind. Conversations captured. Calls. The truth you kept carefully folded behind your lips. I don't need your letters or photographs. I have your voice." Her hands flew to her mouth as though to hold the words in retroactively, as though covering her lips could undo what had already been spilled into the recorder. Tears pricked her eyes again, unbidden, rawer this time. "You can't," she whispered. "You can't listen. It's wrong." "Wrong?" I repeated, softly incredulous. "Tell me what is more wrong, hearing the truth as it fell from your own mouth, or living inside a house where lies breed in silence? What would you call greater cruelty?" She shook her head again, but her resolve had cracks now, fissures spreading across the stone she had tried to stand upon. I pressed the recorder's button. For a moment, only static, the soft hiss of machinery waking from sleep. Then, her voice. Clear, immediate, alive. "I don't know what to do. Every time I see him, it feels like drowning. Like I want to breathe but his presence fills all the air. I can't tell him. I can't tell him because he'll never let it go." Her face drained of color. The recording continued, unspooling with merciless precision. Snatches of sentences, fragments of confession. Words spoken in secrecy to someone who was not me. A friend, perhaps, or a diary of flesh and blood. I did not need to know who. The important thing was what. He notices everything. Too much. I hate that he notices. I wish I could disappear when he looks at me. But I keep going back. Because leaving either of them feels like stepping off a ledge. And I don't know if I'll fly or shatter. I let the tape play only that far before I pressed stop. The silence that followed was brutal in its clarity. She sat frozen, her chest rising and falling too quickly, like a bird trapped against glass. Tears clung to her lashes, but she did not wipe them. She simply stared at the recorder as if it were a weapon aimed at her. "That's the why," I said quietly. "That's what you've been hiding, not just the where, not just the who, but the fear. The contradiction that lives inside you." Her mouth opened, then closed again. When she finally spoke, her voice was broken glass. "You spied on me. You turned our life into a prison." I leaned forward, the candlelight sharpening the angles of my face. "No. I didn't build the prison. I only opened the door so you could see its bars." She let out a sob, the sound torn from somewhere deep. "You don't understand, you never understand." I interrupted, calm but unwavering. "Then explain it. Explain the drowning. Explain the ledge. Explain the man whose name you whispered when you thought no one listened." Her head dropped into her hands. The recorder sat between us, mute again, but heavy as stone. The candle flickered, casting long shadows across the walls like bars stretching up into infinity. For the first time tonight, she looked less like a woman cornered and more like someone unraveling beneath the weight of her own reflection. And that was the point. Revelation is not always about exposing the other. Sometimes it is about holding up the mirror they refuse to face. I leaned back, my voice softer now, almost intimate. "Tell me, then. What truth were you running from when you packed that suitcase? Was it Heimer, was it yourself?" She didn't answer my question. Not directly. She sat there, bent over, fingers knotted in her hair, as though she could rip the memory of her own voice from her skull if she only pulled hard enough. The silence between us had changed. Before, it was a tool I wielded. Now, it had taken on a life of its own, an organism breathing, swelling, pressing against her chest until she gasped for air. Finally, she lifted her head. Her eyes were rimmed red, her lips trembling. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered. "To live with someone who sees everything. Every mistake. Every hesitation. She stopped, choking on the next word. "Every betrayal?" I offered. Her body recoiled, but she did not deny it. The truth had already been spoken once, captured by the recorder. Denial felt hollow now, fragile as the melted wax pooling around the candle's base. "You think you're so perfect," she spat suddenly, the words laced with venom that startled even her. "As if watching makes you righteous. But all it makes you is a collector. You collect moments, flaws, slips of the tongue. You hoard them like trophies. Do you even know what love is anymore?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and jagged. I let it land. I let it wound, not me, but the space between us. Then, very quietly, I asked. "And you? Do you know what love is?" She faltered, caught in her own snare. "Love isn't surveillance," she muttered weakly. "Neither is it secrecy," I countered. The flame snapped, a small burst of wax spattering onto the table, cooling instantly into pale shards. Her gaze darted to it, as though the candle itself were keeping score. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "Do you remember the first time you lied to me?" Her eyes widened. What are you talking about?" "The first time," I repeated, calm but unrelenting. "Not the biggest. Not the most damning. The first. Because betrayals don't start with an affair. They start with something smaller. A withheld detail. A reshaped truth." Her breathing quickened. She shook her head. "I don't." "You do," I interrupted, voice sharp now. "You do. I see it on your face. You remember." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she looked younger, almost childlike, as though dragged backward through time against her will. "It was," her voice cracked. "It was the night I said I was working late. But I wasn't. I needed space. I sat in the car for hours, parked 2 streets away, just staring at the dashboard. I couldn't breathe inside the house. I couldn't breathe next to you. Her confession trembled in the air like glass about to shatter. And did you tell me? I asked softly. Her silence was the answer. I nodded, slow and deliberate. That was the first fracture. Small. Harmless, you thought. But fractures spread. You know this. I gestured to the wax scars on the wood, the melted candle bleeding its life away. They grow. They multiply. Until one day, the structure collapses under their weight. Her tears came again, heavier this time, but quieter. They traced clean lines down her face, glistening in the weak flame. She didn't bother to wipe them. You think I wanted this? She whispered hoarsely. You think I planned for my life to turn into this game of knives? No, I said, almost gently. But wanting doesn't absolve. And games don't appear out of nowhere. Someone begins them. Her head shook violently. No more. I can't do this anymore. She shoved her chair back, the legs screeching against the floor, and stumbled toward the suitcase. Her hand gripped the handle like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. I didn't rise. I didn't stop her. I only spoke, my voice calm, deliberate. Go, if you must. But remember, wherever you run, you will carry yourself with you. And the recorder does not lie. She froze. Her hand clenched the handle tighter, knuckles white. The silence stretched long. Finally, with a trembling exhale, she let go. The suitcase rocked slightly, then stilled, abandoned once more in the hall. She turned back to me, broken, defiant, both at once. Then what do you want from me?